Good evening. My name is Dr. Eldon Yellowhorn. I'm the host of this series. This is co-sponsored by, among other people, the Office for Aboriginal Peoples and the Indigenous Research Institute. This evening, we're very happy to have a recently minted doctor, Rob Mcmahon. I was actually on his defense committee, so I'm interested to see what his presentation is like tonight. He'll be doing his talk on First Nations innovation and decolonization using interactive communications technology. And without further ado, I'll turn the mic over to Rob.
Great, thank you, Eldon. And thanks everyone for coming. I know it's Green Day today. It's St. Paddy's, so appreciate everyone joining us. And I'm not wearing green now, but I swear I have a green jacket somewhere here. So, also I wanted to note that they're not on the screen now, but we have some people who are joining us actually from out east. So we have actually 4 people joining us. We have Ashley Julian from New Brunswick and Fredericton, as well Susan O'Donnell and Brian Beaton, who are also in Fredericton, so that's a 4-hour time difference. So they're joining us at 11 p.m. at night. So huge thank you to them, And as well, Lyle Johnson, who's in Sioux Lookout in Ontario, who helped set up the video conference link that's bringing them into this conversation that we're going to be having tonight. And I also wanted to note that the link that he's using in the video conferencing system is actually owned and operated and managed by a First Nations regional technology organization called KNET. So it's the technology sort of organization established by the Kiiwetnik-Okinawakonik Tribal Council in Northwest Ontario. So I'll be talking a little bit more about KNET, of course they will as well as some of the other First Nations innovations projects that we're researching. Also, big thanks to Rodney and Jean, who's not here, who did a fantastic job just kind of setting up the technical infrastructure that we maybe see or don't see going on here. But we have this laptop that's broadcasting my PowerPoint slides, and that will be featuring, actually we have another one hooked up there that'll be featuring our remote participants. Then we have multiple microphones spread out that our participants who are remotely located can listen to your questions when we get into the Q&A. And we also have a webcam set up here so they can actually see all of you when you can see them. So kind of a neat setup. So thank you very much for that support. That's fantastic. I also wanted to acknowledge we're on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. So thank you to those peoples for the opportunity to speak here today. We're at SFU at the Woodwards building in downtown Vancouver. So I wanted to start with a little bit of context about this project, First Nations Innovation. And then Susan, Brian, and Ashley will talk a little bit about some of the projects that they're doing with that. So just generally speaking, what is First Nations Innovation? What's this project that we're working on together? So researchers from the University of New Brunswick, Atlantic Canada's First Nations Help Desk, the First Nations Education Council in Quebec, and KNET in Ontario are examining policies and practices associated with broadband development in rural and remote First Nations. So that's kind of the focus that we look at First Nations Innovation. But I'll actually start with an example from my PhD dissertation. So this is actually a photo of an Inuit community up in northern Quebec. I visited this when I was doing my PhD field research here at SFU, actually. It's called Ivuyavik, so it's a tiny village, and it's named after the place where ice accumulates. So you can see a few of the icebergs kind of floating around in the bay before the village there, and those kind of flow in and out at different times of the day, different times of the year, that sort of thing. So this community of 340 people, it's only accessible by flight and a seasonal sea barge, and it also relies on a diesel generator for electricity. So it's off the grid, both transportation-wise and in terms of electricity. It houses a radio station, a school, a nursing station, a co-op store, a northern village, which is like the municipal government, a daycare, and a youth center. And also several businesses are based in the village, including an IT company called Pernoma Technologies. The village faces relatively high unemployment rates, but along with their day jobs, the residents continue to live off the land, gathering Murray-Apak eggs and hunting animals like beluga whales and walruses. And the primary language spoken both at home and work is Inuktitut. So here's what the locals call their Canadian Tire. So you can see there a couple of the aisles. There's one there, the bus aisle, and also like the skidoo aisle. So these are kind of where people go to get their spare parts when they're fixing their equipment, that sort of thing. So in Canada, the development patterns of the majority society left many remote communities like Avuyavik disconnected from transportation, electrical, and communications infrastructures. But many Indigenous peoples who live in these remote and rural communities lack equitable access to the public services and economic development opportunities available to people in urban and southern regions. But nonetheless, in this context, a productive agency has emerged from these conditions of scarcity. So Indigenous peoples and their partners are shaping emergent technologies to balance local needs with their connections to globalizing network societies. For example, Indigenous peoples have always built their own communication systems, and this work extends beyond content, so beyond things like film, radio programs, TV, these sort of things, to also include underlying infrastructures. So community radio networks and the National Aboriginal Peoples Television Network are just two examples of how Indigenous communications projects contribute to Canada's media scene. So the photo there, that's Sandy Tuma, and he's the community radio announcer in Kuujjuaq, which is also in northern Quebec. And he helped set up the local FM radio station, and he's been on the air since the 1970s. So, he kind of always wanted to be in radio. He actually had a low power transmitter, set it up at home. It broadcast out to a couple of homes, then extended out throughout the village. And now actually he broadcasts across all 14 communities in Nunavik, all of which are only accessible by plane. So it's kind of this idea of the network getting established locally and then stretching out across these large and relatively inaccessible regions. So with the advent of the internet and broadband connectivity, Indigenous peoples are facing challenges of diffusion and access. So even as networked digital infrastructures become increasingly ubiquitous, many of these communities continue to face digital divides. An observation that has led researchers to question why these access divides in a context of seeming abundance, right? We talk about here, look at this room right now, complete connectivity. We all probably have 4G phones, like these sort of things. But we still have pockets within Canada where access is not available. So in recent years, some researchers are employing participatory approaches that involve affected parties in measuring and accessing these digital divides. So these methodologies actively incorporate the voices of community members in research design, data analysis, and proposing solutions to ICT challenges. So while these initiatives are diverse, they share a common perspective that rather than subjects, communities are self-determining actors that draw on their own internal resources, knowledge, and capacities to develop and use technologies. So in the past decade, Indigenous scholars have been articulating new ways to think about how communities might best develop tools like information and communication technologies. So this literature of Indigenous resurgence foregrounds the role of land, place-based identities, resistance to colonization, and everyday practices. So as Tuck and Yang stress, decolonization is not a metaphor, but rather an ongoing process rooted in struggles over land and requiring material change. So these activities reflect lived experiences that encompass the many ways that Indigenous peoples are connecting to their communities, cultures, and homelands. So from this perspective, decolonization and resurgence are expressed in everyday acts and continually support the renewal of Indigenous communities. And we can see these expressions of resurgence across many different fields, including technology development. So digital infrastructures and ICTs are powerful tools that Indigenous peoples are shaping and developing and using to sustain and grow their communities. Our research at the First Nations Innovation Project demonstrates how ICTs can also be shaped to decentralize power to communities and support the ongoing role of Indigenous peoples as innovators and inventors. This innovation doesn't just happen at the assumed center of the network society, but also at what we often think of as peripheries or nodes or that sort of thing, right? We're seeing these innovations happening everywhere. So we use the concept of the first mile to highlight this focus, and this is countering the technical term within telecommunications that often talks of communities as the last mile. So you'll get like the development of an infrastructure that may start in a center, build out a backbone network, and then finally connect the community and then the households in the community as the last point in that development process. And this idea of the first mile kind of discursively flips that, whereby the community remains the starting point for that process. So the first mile concept, it's been around since at least the 1990s, and for example, framed the projects featured in that book on the left from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, and also the report on the right, which we produced in 2010. So what are we finding in this kind of research around First Nations innovation? And it turns out there's multiple, numerous, so many of these expressions of Indigenous resurgence taking place in these kinds of first mile projects of community-based technology development. So here I'm just showing Avuyavik that I talked about earlier. That's that point on the map there. That's the northernmost village in Quebec. So you can see there the Hudson Bay area, where the ground system is a licensed wireless network remotely managed by Tamanna, which is an internet service provider that's a program of the Kativik regional government. So on the right is the local Tamanna agent, Mosesi Adalak, and he signs up internet customers, he does basic repair work, and he clears snow from the buildings when there's a big snowfall. So right there he's showing us how much snow they get, like in the depths of winter kind of thing. So it's his job to truck out there and shovel it out, clear away the snow from the satellite dishes. The Tamanna System was designed to support economic and community development and keep revenues from broadband services circulating inside the region. So you have people like Mosesi who would collect the revenues from that and then be used within that region to support their regional internet service providers, as opposed to being sort of siphoned out to commercial or other providers that may be located in other regions such as the south. So we're seeing these kinds of Indigenous community broadband projects springing up across Canada. So here's a map showing ones that we've profiled so far on the website. So there's more than 80 there. Actually in Tyendinaga are one of those, as well as some of the communities that we'll hear about later from our remote participants. So one thing to understand about all these community broadband projects is that they don't operate in isolation. We're not talking about isolated, remote, autonomous projects, okay? Many are connected to regional, provincial, territorial, and even national organizations. So described as community intermediary organizations, these member-based nonprofit organizations have been created by Indigenous communities to support local networks and accessing expertise, economies of scale. You can think when purchasing equipment, when buying up bulk bandwidth, the thing it gets distributed around, like that sort of thing. For advocacy support, other kinds of benefits. So for example, the Kativik regional government, which is based in Kuujjuaq, this is the area of northern Quebec where Avuyavik's located, set up Tamanna Internet Services as a community intermediary organization that builds and manages satellite broadband infrastructure and services. So on the right, we have Jean-Francois Dumoulin, who manages Tamanna, and he's standing beside the network server. So that's kind of the regional hub of the network that then extends out to those 14 communities. And then you can imagine that distributes connectivity throughout a satellite that blankets all four of these groups that are only fly-in communities kind of thing. So Indigenous communities across Canada have established organizations like Tamanna to provide technology support services to their constituent populations. So a lot of them are member-based organizations. So Tamanna is kind of a branch of the regional government. In other cases, like KNET, for example, where Lyle and actually Brian formerly worked for, is an association of different independent First Nations that came together through their tribal council, and then other groups joined up and made that. So you have associations of different types of governments, different types of community-based organizations coming together. So they operate complex digital networks and applications while supporting self-determined technology development projects. And as I mentioned, while they share many goals, distinctions among the regions led to a diversity of organizational structures and strategies across Canada. But they also reflect a strong focus on consultation and engagement with their membership of geographically dispersed communities. So oftentimes, a lot of them will be working with these groups that are very dispersed out, only accessible through these kind of remote links. So here's a link showing some of the community intermediary organizations in Canada. You can see that red circle there, so that's the area covered by the Tamanna Internet Service that I was talking about. And I wanted to note that this map's, it's only illustrative, so we actually have other groups operating in the West as well. So we have the First Nations Technology Council here in BC and others in Alberta and elsewhere. So the work of these local and regional organizations is contingent on access to funding and other supports that come from government. Remember, we're discussing really small, remote, and dispersed communities that don't support a traditional business case for the private sector to extend the infrastructure and services. So in this context, these Indigenous organizations have advocated for policy and regulatory support for their technology development initiatives. So as Canada moves towards a digital economy and a network society, government recognizes the persistence of these digital divides. and that the private sector lacks a viable business case to connect them. The Government of Canada has a history of providing supports for broadband in rural, remote, and northern communities. So you can see here, starting in the 1990s, this included a number of programs, and the most recent one at the bottom there is the Digital Economy Strategy, which is providing $305 million over 5 years to extend and enhance services to a targeted 280,000 households. So connecting those households that are still facing this digital divide. In the past, government provided opportunities for both private sector telcos and also community-based nonprofits to access and manage these development funds. This supported the emergence of the local community networks and the regional organizations that I talked about earlier. But at present, it remains to be seen what role local providers and community intermediaries will play in this latest round of funding. So we're not sure the role that they might play here. Indigenous organizations argue that increased control of funds by communities will enable the further development of these digital projects. So to move this work forward, they've recently formed a national advocacy group called the First Mile Connectivity Consortium, or FMCC. So this is composed of nonprofit, First Nations, and Inuit organizations, as well as telecommunications providers that are serving these kind of unserved regions or rural and remote regions. So basically, the organizations operating in these areas where there's no business case to operate have all kind of pushed forward this organization. It's been involved in several policy interventions, including CRTC public hearings, and among its goals, the FMCC seeks to reframe the digital divide from a problem to an opportunity, so seeing how local and regional organizations can support the provision of these infrastructures and services themselves. Advocate for open access to transport infrastructure to enable communities to interconnect their local networks with regional, national, and international systems. To gain equitable access to the same supports that incumbent telcos currently receive. So these would be things like funding for these types of initiatives. And also to ensure that Indigenous peoples are consulted on technology developments taking place on their territories. So other FMCC work includes research, public outreach, and capacity building tools. For example, there's a free course on community technology development that's available on the website at www.fmcc.ca. So I've talked a lot about technical infrastructures. We've got a bit of the theory, the Indigenous resurgence and decolonization framework. We've talked about the organizations. We've talked about the policies, the regulation, and then the advocacy piece. But I haven't really mentioned how people are actually using technologies yet. So here you go. On the photo on the left there, that's an entrepreneur in Avuyavik. His name's Thomas Emanuik. And he actually set up a web and graphic design company. So he has a home-based business there. And he consults with businesses and organizations across that whole region of Nunavik. So the 14 fly-in communities there. He has clients there. He also has employees that he works with. And he uses things like Skype, text messaging, like Facebook, these sort of things, Dropbox, file transfer, in order to connect with them without ever actually kind of seeing them face-to-face or doing so very rarely, kind of thing. So the infrastructure that he uses to use those applications to connect with both his clients and his employees is all from that system that I described with, remember, Mosesi, who sets up and manages the local stuff, and then Jean-François Dumoulin, who helps manage that regional network of the 14 different communities. So here are a few more of these kinds of applications, and I know that Lyle, Susan, and Brian, they've been involved in these things, these particular applications for years and could probably speak to them much better. But just as a quick overview, in Northwest Ontario, the Kiiwetnik Okimakanek Telemedicine, KOTM on the left, that provides services to 26 First Nations, and staff at the local nursing stations can securely transfer x-rays and health records to southern hospitals. They can use the system to remotely connect with physicians and other healthcare professionals. So kind of using similar video conferencing technology that we're using today. They can see a physician, get their blood pressure checked, maybe do like a dermatological exam, like these sort of things. Health personnel also use it to support remote diagnosis, telemental health, so kind of counseling services, that sort of thing. Health records transfer, so data transfer. And as well, things like family visits, right? If you have a family member who may be in a hospital in the south, you can actually connect with people over that system, elders visits, that sort of thing. And then as well, of course, training, that sort of thing, using the system to upgrade courses. KOTM also supports local employment opportunities. So just like Mosesi was setting up and managing that local system up in Avuyavik from a technical side, we also have technicians working on this teleconferencing system for each of the telehealth centers. So on the right there, Kiwetnik Internet High School provides students the opportunity to graduate from high school without having to leave their communities. So students take classes from teachers located in different villages, so some are only accessible by air. The 12 communities that participate combine online and offline learning. So students would take online courses and use video conferencing to connect with classrooms in kind of like, if you imagine like a virtual assembly. So they have maybe a science teacher in one community, and then everybody would be located within their classroom. They'd have a teacher on site to kind of mentor them through the class, but the actual lesson would be taught by one specialist in one community. Then a math teacher will be in a community over here. Everybody kind of turns their video conference channel to that kind of thing, watches that. So it's a way to access this expertise without having to locate it all within a specific community, which can be hard if you're dealing with a community of 300, 200, 300, 400 people kind of thing. So my final point was just around the community engagement element. So that plays a strong role in our research about these projects. So we stress the need to actively incorporate the voice of community members in research design, data analysis, and proposing solutions to policy and practical challenges. So these approaches frame members of communities as creative agents who draw on internal resources and capacities to address their ICT challenges. So over the years, the National Assembly of First Nations have passed several resolutions by chiefs and council linked to connectivity, with the e-community strategy as one outcome of this work. So proposed by the Kiwetnik-Okimakanek Tribal Council and endorsed by the AFN, the strategy advocates for a policy and development framework that emerges from and is driven by communities. It foregrounds how technologies like broadband can support public services like health, education, administration, economic development, and justice, and argues for the need to enable communities to retain the control and ownership of broadband systems and applications, and shape technology development to meet their needs. So with that, what I'll do is turn it over to the rest of the FNI team members who are here. We have 4 people here with us today. We have some other members who weren't able to make it today, and I thank everyone who can join us so much. I know it's a brutal time change. I mean, we're talking about, I think it's probably about 11:30 p.m. out in New Brunswick right now. But we have Susan O'Donnell, Brian Beaton, and Ashley Julian. And again, thank you to Lyle, who's supporting us through the video conferencing link. And I guess what we'll do is we've got you all up on the screen. So Ashley, yeah, take it away. Thanks so much. I noticed you're wearing green too, right on.
Hello, everyone. I just want to introduce myself, but first off, I just want to give a recognition to which territory are we in again there, Rob? Squamish?
The Coast Salish.
Coast Salish? Okay, yeah. I just want to give recognition to the Coast Salish territory that we have the opportunity to tune in through digital technology to have the opportunity to present to you. My name is Ashley Julian. I'm originally from the Indian Brook Shubenacadie Band First Nation in Nova Scotia. So we are about 20 kilometers from the Halifax airport. It's kind of the First Nations community in which I grew up in. Again, as Rob mentioned, I'm a researcher with the First Nations Innovation Project, and also I'm a graduate student at the University of New Brunswick in Masters of Education, Critical Studies. I have a lot of background and experience working with our Atlantic Policy Congress of First Nations Chiefs here. I co-founded our regional youth council, the Mcmahon Maliseet Atlantic Youth Council. I also served some time as the co-chair for the female co-chair position with the Assembly of First Nations National Youth Council, where I represented Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. I've been involved in a lot of Mi'kmaq cultural events and presentations in the past as well. One of the examples that are included in my introduction is In 2010, I attended the Indigenous Youth Gathering in BC for the 2010 Winter Olympics, and also I powwow dance, and I teach culture and traditions, and one of my major focuses for my thesis proposal, as I am a first year, is on language resurgence. So one of the things that I'm talking about with you guys today is digital technologies and Indigenous culture and language resurgence. One of the things I'm working on with First Nations Innovation Projects is how do we see the 21st century 7th generation, as I would consider myself, and how is digital technologies a tool for protecting and the promotion of Indigenous culture and language resurgence. One of the main, I would say, decolonizers that I like to look at is Lianne Sampson. And Lianne Sampson talks about resurgence as our instruction. I believe resurgence is our duty to maintain and recover and reclaiming our Indigenous languages. As we know, there's 53 distinct Indigenous languages across Canada, and 3 of them are surviving, with the rest of them on the verge of extinction. And we, as one of the terms that I've come across, is language suicide and language genocide. And when Simpson discusses resurgence, she asserts that we have to regenerate our languages so that we have our communities of fluent speakers. We need our elders, our languages, along with vision, intent, and commitment, and which all essentially build healthier communities. And ultimately, I feel for myself that it has been a struggle leaving my First Nations community to pursue academics, and especially being at the master's level. I did a discussion earlier today talking about rebuilding capacity building between university and Indigenous communities, and I feel that digital technology and information technology and communication technology offers an opportunity for, as Rob mentioned, for First Nations youth in the community to have an opportunity to get their graduate degrees, but also an opportunity for where we have in the Atlantic provinces the Bachelor of Education program being offered in our First Nations communities, so that we can make sure that we are educating more teachers to teach in our Mi'kmaq and Maliseet communities here in the East Coast. One of the discussions that we have is that Indigenous youth are demonstrating a growing interest in information technology for their learning, language learning. Sorry guys. The potential for ICT strategies for cultural and language resurgence are strategy again for building healthier communities. And one of the documents that I had, and I am fortunate to have read and worked with Susan O'Donnell, and she had written, she could probably mention this, but she has written a document that talks about the importance of ICT and building healthier communities, and also how it's a tool to reach in a lot of our off-reserve speakers. One of the things that I feel that is multimedia technology, social networking, interactive talking dictionaries, and language app developments are tools that are collecting digital stories of our elders and effective ways for linguist revitalization for youth, especially in the face of settler colonialism. One of the things that myself I feel like I'm trying to figure out is decolonization, and how is decolonization applying to myself, and how I am, as most Indigenous youth will feel, is sometimes we're tokenizing our classrooms to kind of produce the information. So sometimes I struggle, are we decolonizing the minds of the colonizers, or are we trying to, what Murray Batiste, for example, talks about when decolonizing education. One of the things that I just want to mention is in the East Coast, and especially Nova Scotia, is we have Mcmahon, which is an organization that works in our Cape Breton community, which if you look at a Nova Scotia map, you would see the top that Cape Breton is located. And we have an opportunity to have our First Nation schools. And through those First Nation schools, they have developed different language apps the Mi'kmaq language apps, that young people now have an opportunity that they can access the language now within their cell phones. Fortunately, the app is only provided for Apple products at the moment, but in the future, I'm sure that all Android devices will have access to these language apps. One of the things that I'm doing also with my research is I had the opportunity to sit. I was raised by my grandmother and my grandfather, which are elders. My grandmother, a residential school survivor, and I just really wanted to give recognition and ownership to, sorry, the oral tradition. So one of the things I really look at is autoethnography and how I can incorporate that in my research. And discussing digital technology with my grandmother, she really looks at technology as a benefit, but she also sees the challenges with it. One of the main challenges she finds right now is that there's this huge disconnect between the elders and youth as a result of digital technology. And I would assume that that's because our cell phones and digital technology gives us access to social media, and what we need to do is find ways to really gain the interest of the young generation and find innovative ways for them to seek strategies for language use with these devices. We have another member that works with us, and he had the opportunity through his own experience of using websites for language resurgence, and he was taking 5 hours a day to go through Mi'kmaq language and write down words. But one of the disconnects that he found through this technique was that it took away from the interaction that you would have with the elders or with community speakers. And that's one of the struggles that we find in language resurgence, is that when we leave our First Nations communities to pursue academics, it says, how do we continue to bring our language with us into the academia? One of the things that I find really exhausting is when we enter into our classrooms, and we have to elaborate a lot of and try to include Indigenous inclusion within our courses. So that could be a challenge that he had faced. And my grandmother went through our interview, discussed about how we are evolving, and as we are evolving for the next 7 generations, is going to evolve. And one of the concerns that I have is how is that interactive talking dictionary is going to be helpful for the preservance of our language. If we think now, we all know elders are our speakers, and if we look in the next decade, as the winter months continue to pass, Grandmother Moon Spirit will take all our weak ones during the cold winter months, and as we've realized this past winter, we've lost so many of our speakers. And utilizing technology for us as the younger generation is a great opportunity for us to make sure that we're preserving language. But as I mentioned, my grandmother mentioned that one of the challenges is that our language is a descriptive language, that is the Mi'kmaq language, and that language is that it describes how things are evolving. And if we're dependent on our our talking dictionaries, we're not going to let the language evolve. And as teachers like myself that have struggled to for myself, become fluent because I'm continuously away from my land and my territory and my community, it's been a struggle, but also there's a benefit to the utilizing of those digital technology devices that can preserve language resurgence. And that's kind of the scope of where I have been leading with my discussion. So I want to just kind of end there so that it gives opportunity for Susan and Brian to kind of continue with our project and where we're going.
Thanks, Ashley. This maybe you can tell everyone where you are right now instead of Rob said that you were in Fredericton, but I know that that's not quite right.
Right now, I'm actually in the Lesquigush First Nation community. It's in the really corner of Quebec, right across the bridge from New Brunswick. So if you know if you look at a map, you look for Campbellton, New Brunswick, literally you go across the bridge and there's the Wet'suwet'en First Nations. We have 3 First Nations communities in the Gaspé coast of Quebec, in the Quebec area.
Thanks, Ashley. Like, I think that highlights one of the strengths and one of the reasons that we've done this work, that I've been involved with this work for close to 30 years, and working for First Nations and being in a very privileged position. My late wife was an Indigenous lady from Lac Seul First Nation, and it's the nearest community to Sioux Lookout, where Lyle is located right now. And so all my children are still in northwestern Ontario, and I'm here in Fredericton now, just in the last couple of years. And one of the things that I want to highlight is the leadership that the First Nations took in that region back in the risks that they took, but also the leadership they took in back in 1994, and when they identified wanting to introduce computers, introduce telecommunications systems that they could own and that they could operate in their own communities. And they took a real leadership role because 3 of the communities had no telephones. These brand new communities in the middle of the bush, like, you know, right now the winter roads are disintegrating, they're melting, the snow's melting, and so the trucks are no longer able to go. I think people are still trying to push through, but I hear it's pretty rough right now. I've been following it online, and so the roads are all disappearing. They only last for a couple of months. And the trucks that haul the fuel in and haul the lumber in and everything else, they wreck the roads. They have about a 3-week window to haul all that material into these communities in northwestern Ontario. So these communities are very isolated, and I think it's very important to frame all of this discussion around why communication technologies are so important. And so what's happened in the past is the government has paid the corporations to take care of everything. But like in their great designs of new communities and everything else, they left out telecommunications. I think they just expected the corporations to go ahead and do it because, you know, for whatever reason. But then they ran out of money, and you know, in setting up these communities. And so 3 of the communities had no telephones whenever I began working with Mcmahon. And so we put in satellite systems to do computer communications. And we were connecting in a number of different ways. And that was the beginning point for KNET and the Kakana network. That was over 20 years ago. And so in a lot of ways, back in when we finally got high speed, somewhat high speed, I remember in 2001, one of the gentlemen from one of these remote communities, Kiwewan, he was at a conference, and he said he could hardly wait to get home because his internet was so much better in his community, where he only had gotten telephones the year before. This was in Kiwewan, and and so he made the statement in his presentation that the internet service in the hotel sucked compared to what he had at home. But, like, you know, as we all know today, you go to a hotel and you get, like, you know, the high speed, people, like the home service that I'm using right now for my connection is better than what they have in these communities and what they can afford. Because once again, the telco is in control of that bandwidth and selling that service to the community network. the services that Rob introduced in terms of Mcmahon, the telemedicine network, like we were able to get that high speed back in 2000 because we insisted on video conferencing for telemedicine applications to deliver health services. One of the chiefs I worked with, his mother was an elder, flew into Winnipeg for an appointment, and died sitting in the waiting room. And that was a real wake-up call. And so telemedicine became an opportunity, because it was just a checkup, for Pete's sake, to see a physician for a checkup or a follow-up. And it like these kinds of experiences, like, you know, there's so many of these kinds of stories. Lyle Johnson, who's taking care of the video conferencing, the bridging capabilities, has been doing that for a long time. And he's at home as well in Sioux Lookout. He used to live in the farm, in one of the communities, one of those remote communities that I just described. And so he really knows these, like, you know, what it's like. And the people that are doing this work, Rob mentioned a couple of technicians that are taking care of that facility that everyone's sitting in Vancouver. These communities have a technician taking care of the whole, taking care of the telemedicine, taking care of the internet high school, taking care of the homes, trying to keep everything going in all the different buildings in the administration and band office. One person doing all of this kind of stuff, one technician. And he's usually not paid. Or the pay is really minimal. And in government buildings, complete floors or complete departments usually have 2 or 3 technicians taking care of things. So there's a lot of challenges that are still existing, a lot of inequalities, a lot of work that needs to be done. And so what we're involved with now, I worked with Rob. Rob did a pretty good job of presenting the stories that led to his doctoral work. And now he's in Vancouver, and he's soon going to be moving to Edmonton, and we're all so happy for him. And he did a pretty good job. He came to visit. He came and saw us, met us, learned about us, talked about our work, and now is able to present about it. He got his doctoral thesis, and hopefully people like Ashley and others will be doing the same. And because I think these stories are the ones that celebrate that innovation, that celebrate the risk-taking, what people are doing, like, you know, putting things together, making things work, like, you know, running their own Canadian Tire in the north, like, you know, with their skidoos, their cars, their vehicles and stuff like that, making things work. And I just really have learned so much myself. I feel very privileged to be in the position I'm in now, working for these communities, being able to share these stories and share their stories as much as, like, you know, because of this relationship that they gave to me the opportunities to learn this, and to be involved with this and do the work that's necessary to do it. So I think Susan will talk a little bit more about the research side of things, so that the documentation side.
Thank you, and that was Brian Beaton. I don't know, did you actually introduce yourself? Ashley, I was just going to ask if you could mute your microphone there, just if it's not on mute. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me to join you here this evening in Vancouver. And as Ashley mentioned, I would also like to give thanks to the Coast Salish people for inviting me virtually into your space. I'm on unceded Maliseet territory here, Wolastoq territory. The St. John River runs right through Fredericton, where I am today. And it is important to acknowledge the land that we're on. And I've been doing this kind of research with a series of projects that's now called the First Nations Innovation Project for a little over 10 years now. Been working with Brian and Lyle all through that time, with Rob, I guess probably at least 4, probably going on 5 years now, Ashley for about a year. And it's been a really amazing research journey. I'll just tell you a little bit about the project and then go on to talk about some of the research we're doing. So this project, as I mentioned, has been going on for about 10 years. We have been meeting every month by video conference, like we're doing today, across 4 time zones, 4 different provinces over that time, every month, and sharing our experiences to move this project forward. Over that time, we've worked with many graduate students, primarily at the University of New Brunswick, but we also worked with Rob in partnership with Simon Fraser University on the First Mile project that he mentioned, and that's been going on for about 5 years. So we've been doing research in all the different areas that have been mentioned, including telehealth, telemedicine, distance education. We're now doing language resurgence and digital technologies. Yes, the cellular, the Kiwetinoong mobile. We have some publications in the Canadian Journal of Communications on social media in remote First Nations and the Kiwetinoong mobile. We have a number of publications on different aspects of policy and broadband. I would just like to mention, because Ashley mentioned Lianne Sampson, I would just like to mention some of the authors that we use that are really important to our development. And it's important when we're doing this work to, whenever we can, to engage with Indigenous authors who really shape our thinking. Certainly Lianne Sampson, as Ashley mentioned. We have Marie Batiste, as Ashley mentioned as well. And I think Rob mentioned Eve Tuck and her work on decolonization is not a metaphor. Out in Vancouver, we have we take inspiration, I should say, from Glenn Coulthard, who's at UBC in Victoria at the Indigenous Governance Institute, Jeff Corntassel and Tyga Alfred. Pam Palmatier, who's at Ryerson, who's actually from Cape Breton. Mcmahon from Cape Breton, who's at Ryerson University. You're shaking your head. She's Eel River Bar.
Yeah, Eel River Bar.
She's from Eel River Bar?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. So,
Yeah.
okay, wow. That's so cool. So Pam Palmatier, who you may know, she's been writing a lot on Indigenous resurgence at Ryerson University. Ashley mentioned settler colonialism. And of course, Ashley Julian, our up-and-coming young scholar, who's inspiring me every time we meet. Ashley mentioned settler colonialism. That's a very important part of our work. We're part of the founding members of the Settler Colonialism and Decolonization cluster of the Canadian Sociological Association. And if any of you are going to the Congress this year, which is at the University of Ottawa, we're all going to be there. Rob, Ashley, Brian, myself, as well as our other research partners, Tim Whiteduck, Kevin Burton, Franz Seibel, and Chris George, who Ashley mentioned, who's another graduate student working with us. We have 2 panels at the Canadian Sociological Association on June the 1st or the June the 2nd. So if you're interested, you could ask Rob for details. You're all very welcome to come. Ashley and Brian also have papers at CASE, which is the Canadian Association for Studies in Indigenous Education. And also Brian and another collaborator that we have, David Curley, who's the director of the Mcmahon Willistuck Center at the University of New Brunswick, have a paper in the ANSWER, which is the Association for Social Economy and Nonprofit Research. So we're very multidisciplinary and we do research in a number of different areas. Trying to think of what else we can say, but I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking that it's meant to be just an hour, so I'd like to have some time for Q&A, and I can see there's some people in the audience and would like to give you a chance to ask questions about whatever you'd like. about our work or anything that we're doing. I could talk a lot more about what we're doing, the methodologies that we're using, the research ethics, our publication policy, our broadband policy, how we do our work, but I'll just turn it back to you, Rob, and we'll see what people are interested in talking about. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you
Yes.
hear me? Okay. Okay. Great. Yeah. Thanks so much, all three of you. That was fantastic. Yeah. So I thought we could just do that then. Why don't we just open the floor up? So if anyone has any questions, just raise your hand. Sure.
Hi, good evening. And thank you very much for staying up so late to participate in the lecture tonight. I know it's going on to midnight there. My question is, technology has developed so fast, and how do you stay abreast of the changes in technology? And it almost seems like every week the new gadgets are coming out, or else what we thought was cutting edge is suddenly obsolete. How do you stay abreast of the changes in technology?
Well, I'm going to say something briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Ashley. If you're talking about me personally, I actually work, I should have introduced myself, Susan O'Donnell obviously, but I'm an adjunct professor at the University of New Brunswick, but I'm also a researcher at the National Research Council in the Human-Computer Interaction team, and I work in Fredericton. And I work with a very dynamic group of developers and engineers and computer scientists who are constantly throwing new things at me, many times in early stage development. So I try and just kind of by osmosis, I pick things up that way. Ashley, I'll turn it over to you. I have a feeling that you're quite a bit younger than me. You may have a different way of learning about new technology.
Hi, thank you. I have to say that sometimes I wish I kept up with digital technology as much as I liked. One of the things that I really engage with is that I find that's most beneficial are the opportunities to have audiobooks read to you. I feel like digital technology is far so advanced now that we now can have access to audiobooks that read to us, and we have access to opportunities that for people that struggle with the language to hear and to kind of repeat, increase that opportunity. One of the discussions I was having earlier today is that when you look at children in early childhood education, and they're so far more advanced in technology than I would say myself, because they navigate so easily when they pick up iPads, when they get access to the computer, and when they get on, their parents' iPhones, for example, and now we have all the information available. And one of the things that I would just say that frightens me is that with accessible information, are we actually retaining and restoring this information? But to answer your question, I would say, like, even myself, with trying to keep up with research and trying to keep up with digital technology, I'm having a hard time trying to keep track of all the opportunities to get the language from the different websites, also with the new events and apps that are becoming available, and then just having continuous access to all these different technologies can kind of keep one person on edge, because you're trying to keep up, but you're also trying to learn at the same time and retain and make sure you're in the process of the resurgence.
Can I just add to that? We at one time, the communities that I was working with had the leading edge technologies, but it quickly became legacy equipment, and the upgrades and the cost of the upgrades, and then all the training that had gone into training the technicians to use this technology, to upgrade it, to be able to pay for the training. The dollars, the communities get it once. The second time and the third time becomes very, very difficult to do the kinds of upgrades that people enjoy. So 2G mobile cellular was put in. The upgrade to 3G is just happening today. LTE exists in other centers. So it's next to impossible for these small communities to do it on their own. The business case that Rob talked about, it's a different type of business case. There is a business case, it just doesn't belong with the telcos or the corporations. But it is community-centered in terms of dollars being able to stay in the communities, but it's not enough to be self-sustaining to do the kinds of upgrades that you talk about. So there's a lot of challenges along those lines, but we're still able to meet, we're still able to talk, and we use the equipment, and that's probably part of that innovation. That is part of the innovation that takes place in the communities in terms of doing the best that they can with what they have to work with.
Actually,
I hope that answers your question.
hey Brian, I was gonna just mention one thing as well, that there's that component, but there's also that idea of building those networks that then get upgraded. So, you know, back in 1994 when KNet was first getting established, it was over telephone lines, interconnecting communities, then over time that develops into cable, right? Now we're seeing fiber optics and mobile and that sort of thing. So, you know, like the institutions and the capacity that gets built by the community members too, not so much on the technical side, but also on sort of the social or organizational side. You see what I'm saying? Like as the new technology comes in, those social relationships are established.
No doubt, like, you know, it does, but like the big thing is now it's trying to keep up and trying to improve and change. The same thing happened with satellite and being able to, the satellite serve communities, like, you know, trying to get additional bandwidth to be able to support the applications that people need to be using and wanting to be used. So those challenges exist. There is a cost. There's a cost to being able to do that, and the government is obligated in a lot of ways because now everyone has to do all their government services, access all the government services online, and yet there's communities without the kinds of bandwidth that, like, you know, the example that I used in terms of our own house has more bandwidth than an entire community that serves an entire community with all the applications you talked about.
I just wanted to just follow up on that point and the point Rob mentioned. I think, Rob, you tend to be very self-effacing when you talked about the FMCC, the First Mile Connectivity Consortium, which is the policy arm of this team, I guess. Rob is actually coordinating it, and he played a big part in setting it up. And to date, Rob has worked to coordinate, I think it's 3 presentations, submissions so far. Is it 3? Even though we've been in operation for less than a year formally as a registered nonprofit, 3 submissions to the CRTC, and we're just gearing up to do a big one for the basic service objective that's going to come out in June, and we'll probably have maybe a year to work on that one, I'm not sure. But the point I want to make is that we see the importance of the policy and regulatory framework to make sure that these communities that everybody's talking about here have a better playing field, you know, a more even playing field, so that they can actually I don't even like the word compete in this context, but so they can actually develop the technologies, the broadband required in their communities in a more equitable way. And so the government funds that are used to develop this infrastructure across many of the remote areas of the country are not just basically handed over to the telecommunications companies to do what they will and make their profits, but that the benefits flow primarily through the communities. So it's about finding the right mix of policy and partnerships and working together with academics, with the community intermediaries, as Rob mentioned, the regional and the regional organizations with the local communities. So that's what we're trying to do it on a number of fields. I always send the welcome out. If anyone in the audience today is interested in this kind of research, if there's any researchers out there in particular, and you'd like to, to get involved in some of the activities we're doing, please talk to Rob afterwards, and we're always looking for collaborators. So, thanks.
Hi. This question is probably more directed towards Ashley, but anyone feel free. A few years ago, I started sort of traveling overseas and doing some volunteer work. And what I found was that sort of interactive communication technologies has sort of had the opposite effect of basically preserving traditional values. Lots of the students I work with, they more resemble almost Vancouverites than they do their own grandparents and stuff. There's really a huge sort of cultural divide there. So my question is, what are some of the effective tactics and strategies you use to sort of galvanize and motivate youth to basically preserve or evolve sort of traditional cultural values and really get away from colonialism?
Thank you. I like to think that I'm very fortunate because I have my grandparents to guide me along the way when I am learning and using my cultural practices. I have to say I've been engaged in cultural practices since birth, so as a young child I had all of those opportunities. One of the things that I use to kind of keep me on track is I try to FaceTime. It's a glorious opportunity to see each other now with my grandparents. And also, one of the things that I do to help through my Bachelor of Education program was networking with teachers. So I have taught the Medicine Wheel teachings, and I have taught our Seven Sacred Grandfathers teachings, and I've talked about the Mi'kmaq culture using Skype to Skype into classes in England, also in Saskatchewan, also and through Manitoba. And those kind of are ways that to help me stay motivated, because I know that using technology gives me an opportunity to tune in with people across Canada, with also people across North America. I would say that one of the things that I really like about technology is that we have a way to record now, and when we record we have an opportunity to revisit, and by revisiting we are reflecting, and by reflecting we're actually taking in information that we can use again over and over. And sometimes we say that because of funding, I say disadvantages, because we are with digital technology advancing so quickly, a lot of our material becomes outdated. And so that can be kind of discouraging when you're looking on the web to try to get the most up-to-date information on your cultural teachings. One of the things that our Mi'kmaq speakers are making audiobooks, as I mentioned earlier, and those audiobooks you can get on using iPads. You go to Apple and they read to you, and they have visual images, and those are the things that really kind of pull me in. I had an opportunity to present in all the Atlantic First Nations communities and on the Maritimes in the Atlantic provinces. So having those strong connections to the communities, I feel like when I research the communities, when I look at their community websites for each band council, I have an opportunity to look within where their technology runs, for how they describe their communities, their policies, what's available within the First Nations communities, and having access to those information, I think, is again how I feel connected with communities. And one of the things that too is really great is that we have opportunities to get digital newsletters, and those digital newsletters gives us that up-to-date information, what's happening in the community, and how we can be able to participate. Using also audio conferencing gives us that opportunity as well. I heard someone, was there something?
Oh. Yeah, Brian wanted to.
I just, my kids, they're still in Northwestern Ontario, and they might be seen by people in Vancouver or in the cities as being very urban in a lot of ways, but at the same time, they spend, as Ashley talked about, with their friends, their families, they're in the communities as well. They work in the communities. And they, like, you know, today the workshop that we were in, Ashley, myself, Susan, we were in a workshop, a sharing circle, and there was a lot of talk about, it's not so much the people in the communities that have a lot to learn. It's the people outside those communities that look in and see what they, like a lot of themselves, they see what, then it takes a long time to be able to understand and learn about those communities and the people, the work that is taking place in those communities. I spent 30 years in those communities, and I still recognize that how little I know. The more time I spent there, the less, like the more work and more time it would take to be able to understand all the things, all the dynamics that exist in those communities, and the work that it takes to be an Indigenous person in this colonial state that we live in. So, like, I think that whenever we travel and take, like, you know, do the work that we do, I think we've got to be very careful about, like, you know, putting our own work, like, experiences on those situations. And that message came out loud and clear from the elders, the people that we were listening to today. And like, I just really appreciated that.
I just would like to say something on that too, because it's a really interesting question. And given the day that's in it, I'm going to say something about Ireland. I'm a dual citizen, actually. I'm an Irish citizen as well as a Canadian citizen. And obviously Ireland has a shared history of colonialism. The way the Irish overthrew the colonizers would unfortunately not be allowed today. It was an armed revolution. That's not allowed anymore. But I did want to say something about cultures and cultures changing. I think in terms of traditional culture, etc., you know, if you go to Dublin today and you see, you know, lots of people with cell phones. In fact, Dublin had, or Ireland had, I think, one of the highest uptakes of cell phones in the early days. And nobody would say that somehow people weren't Irish because they were using cell phones, or, you know, people aren't Irish because we're not just kind of living on potatoes anymore, whatever. And that cultures, you know, and I'm not trying to trivialize the question because it's a really important question, but cultures change. They're changing really quickly right now, but they change. And there's still lots of opportunities to hold on to traditional values and traditional ways of being while using cell phones and, you know, doing all kinds of things. And it's just a question of, you know, some of the examples that Ashley's talking about staying rooted in her culture, staying rooted to her family and her communities, and at the same time trying to make these technologies work for her and for her family and for her communities and her nation. So it's finding a balance, I guess. And you know, there are no easy answers, but I think there's lots of examples there about cultures, and I did mention the Irish. There's a lot more that have come through very, very difficult hundreds of years of colonization, and, you know, are shaping their own ways of being, and they're still very, very strong, even though they don't look the way they might have before the colonizers came or whatever. So yeah, I just wanted to add that, given that it's St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you.
Can I add a couple of examples just in terms of that sort of shaping of those technologies? So, I mean, Brian, as well as sort of you know, actually talking about kind of the mobile apps and the language apps, we're seeing a lot of that kind of creation, so shaping the digital ICTs for that sort of thing. The First Nations Technology Council was involved in actually putting together a texting, you know, I believe it was close, I'm not sure which, I think it was Musqueam maybe, but you could text in Musqueam, so that kind of type of technology and cell phones. Brian was involved, you know, before Facebook existed, you know, myKNUT.org, right? This was a social network that was developed by the First Nations people in Northwest Ontario. I think they had 15,000 members or so, like years before Facebook was invented. So there you have a First Nations
30
network. 30? Wow.
30,000. And it was 1 million hits a month, 1 million hits a day at its peak before Facebook kind of took over.
So,
Facebook is now very popular up north.
yeah, absolutely. And also, I mean, Instagram, right? I'm sure a lot of people in the audience here have an Instagram account. And I actually just saw a study that was out of the University of California, the Santa Barbara campus. And what they did was there's a tribal digital village. It's a community network that you know, operates like in the sense of selling internet services to people, but also doing e-health, online education, that kind of thing. And they actually installed a tracking kind of thing. It was anonymous, so they weren't invading people's privacy, but they wanted to see where the Instagram photos that people were uploading were coming from and where they were going. And they found that the majority of the sharing, I think it was 4 times or so, was happening within that community. So we're also seeing the way that people are using these new social platforms like Instagram, like Facebook. When you actually look at the technical side, they're circulating that and creating that information locally too. So just wanted to add that too. Oh, are we, okay, do we have time for one more? Or? Yeah, and then, yeah, thanks everyone for staying too. It must be about midnight there now. So why don't we have one more question?
Can I ask this question? David Bowie, he once said that the internet is the greatest democratic tool, and listening to the presentation from all of you, each of you, I'm thinking of what would happen if these communities didn't have the kind of access, albeit somewhat limited and growing today, but what if they didn't have that? Could these communities continue to fully participate in Canadian society and influence Canadian society as democratic members of Canada? So I guess my question really is, as a democratic tool, do you see how this can be effective, the work that you're doing?
I guess Ashley and I are both in critical studies in education. And so, like, right away, whenever you ask that question, like the flags go up, like, the masters, who controls what? And like, and who has the biggest voice, who has the most power? And whenever it comes down to power, and one of the examples is like the organization I worked for 2 years ago, KNET, helped I set that up. It has to now take out loans to be able to do the kinds of upgrades that the first gentleman asked about. And those loans are going to tie them to the banks, to the government. And so, like, who's in charge? Like, who's wagging the dog's tail? And like, we all, and First Nations that I've worked for, the leaders, the chiefs that I've worked for, they understand that very well. Like, they've lived it, this colonial experience for so long. So if it's a democracy, like, those are nice words and all of those kinds of things. It's just, it's a tool. And whether, like, how it gets used, who uses it, or how it gets abused is a whole other aspect of it. And like, Susan's done some work on that. I know that, like, a lot of the stuff that Ashley referenced, like, addresses that already. But it is an important question, and I'm glad you asked it, because I think it really summarizes the challenges that exist for all of us in terms of the use of these communication tools. We've seen the challenges that exist on a global level.
Question, thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you as well to everyone for joining us from from New Brunswick, and almost, I'm not sure if Listic Reach is in Quebec side or New Brunswick side, but yeah, thanks so much, Ashley, and thanks again, Lyle Johnson, for making the connection. Okay, good night, everyone. See ya.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Have a nice